where you will hear from Stanford University's Dr. Jack Baker and NHERI GSC members Natalie Coleman and Amar Abukhalaf on all things academic publishing. And all of our workshops are recorded and posted on the NHERI GSC website, so you'll be able to revisit the recording for future reference. And so for this workshop, we're going to do as much as we can in 1 hour, and we'll start with a presentation on academic publishing by Dr. Baker, which will then be followed by a panel with him and Natalie and Amar to answer questions on academic publishing. And that's including questions you think of throughout the duration of the workshop. And so to briefly introduce the NHERI Graduate Student Council for anyone here who might not be familiar, this workshop has been a collaborative effort among students in the NHERI GSC. And so our purpose here is to build a diverse graduate community for natural hazards researchers, to connect with diverse mentors in the natural hazards community, to attend natural hazards research and career workshops, to encourage diversity, equity, and inclusion conversations, to learn about the impact of research on natural hazards practice, and to gain leadership, service, and funding opportunities. And so for those present who are graduate students or researchers and are not currently members, you can scan the QR code that's on this slide here to join us and become involved in these types of events with like-minded researchers. And also for any non-graduate students who are here, we would still love for you to become involved if you're interested in supporting the NHERI GSC. And so this QR code here will allow you to do that. And so now I would like to introduce Dr. Jack Baker, who will be presenting on insights into academic publishing, and his presentation will be followed by a Q&A panel where he will also be available to answer questions you already have coming into this workshop and any questions you may think of while you're listening to his presentation. And so without further ado, I would like to go ahead and introduce him. Jack Baker is a professor of civil and environmental engineering and associate dean for faculty affairs in the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability. He uses probabilistic and statistical tools to quantify and manage disaster risk and resilience. He is an author of the textbook Seismic Hazard and Risk Analysis, director of the Stanford Urban Resilience Initiative, editor-in-chief of Earthquake Spectra, and a co-founder of the Haselton-Baker Risk Group. His awards include the Shaw Family Innovation Prize from the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute, the Career Award from the National Science Foundation, and the Walter L. Huber Prize from the American Society of Civil Engineers. He is passionate about explaining unwritten rules in academia, which he'll do today, and has spent the past few years writing and speaking to graduate students about topics such as academic publishing. I'd like to say thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Baker. I'll now turn things over to you. And for anyone who has questions, I ask that you just please hold them until the panel session, which we will have following this presentation.
All right, thanks a lot, Jasmine. Hello, everybody. I'm really pleased to be here. This is a, I think, great program and a great organization, and I was very happy to get the invitation to come join you. All right, let me see if I've got a few slides I can share with you, but I'm more excited to have a little conversation later and some back and forth. But let me share a few thoughts to get us kicked off here. Make sure I can still see your faces a little bit. Okay, does that look all right?
Yep.
Okay, great. So yeah, so what I wanted to do is bring you kind of a few high-level ideas about, maybe you've heard this term before, the hidden curriculum. I kind of like this, that, we have this academic publishing system, and the rules are not like intended to be secret, but they are hidden from a lot of people, right? There's a lot to figure out. It's a pretty complex system. And, some folks are fortunate enough to have advisors or other sources of information, but others, it's a little less accessible. And so I really hope through events like this, we can kind of unhide these hidden parts and make it a little more transparent what's going on, and hopefully help everybody kind of reach their full potential in this world to the extent they want to engage with it. So first, a couple extra words about me. So you heard a bio, and bios can sound nice for folks that have been around for a long time, but I thought it'd be like a little more informal and kind of pull back the curtain a little bit. So I started graduate school 20-something years ago. It doesn't feel like that long ago, but I know maybe some of you weren't even born yet then. So at some point I was a graduate student and I didn't know any of this stuff. So first of all, just like don't take this as something that I walked into this world knowing what was going on. and somehow you're different than me. I had to figure this out all along the fly, but after 20 something years, I've got a lot better handle on it. So started in undergraduate school, started working on papers with my PhD advisor, got a paper accepted in 2005, a very important event in any graduate student's life. I also got a paper rejected in 2005, and it's not the last one. So this is not some sort of like unprecedented event or some event that means that you're a failure as a scholar or anything like that. It's just part of the journey that goes along as figuring out kind of where the bar is and navigating a process that's not always perfectly making decisions. Around the same time, I started getting asked to review papers on occasion. So I started reviewing papers. That's an important part of this world, as we'll talk about in a little bit. And then a few years along, I started a faculty job in like 2006 as well. I joined an editorial board in 2008 and did that for about 10 years. Took on kind of a more senior role in a journal about 10 years later. Did that for about 5 years. And then this year I became an editor-in-chief at Earthquake Spectra. So I'm kind of the first person that technically reviews all the papers coming into Earthquake Spectra, which is a journal I expect some of you know or engage with. So at this point, and maybe keep going. I've written something like 100 papers. I've written paper reviews on something like 500 papers. It's ballpark. And then as editor-in-chief of Earthquake Spectra, I see 200 or 250 papers a year come in. And so I have a lot of repetitions of kind of seeing stuff that's really, inspiring and impactful, seeing stuff where something kind of fell short or somebody didn't understand it. With my own work as well, I've got a lot of repetitions of some, hopefully mostly successes, but some failures as well. And so kind of trying to sort through all of those things. I'll see if I can give you some patterns or some general advice. But again, to emphasize, like, I didn't show up in 2023, my first time dealing with this. It's decades of work and things. And so hopefully I can accelerate the process for you, but you shouldn't feel like you need to know everything out of the gate if you're kind of more towards the top of the slide in terms of your journey. Maybe just a quick comment that, I think peer review in this scholarly publication, is really a pretty amazing system. I think it's not without its flaws. But this idea that, we're all working on very specialized topics and we have, very detailed knowledge we're trying to add, to the world's collective knowledge on some topic. But there's not some sort of organization out there that knows exactly what you're doing or why your work's important. And so we have to kind of, bring in these papers, give them to peers, your peers who are going to provide reviews, and the journals try to manage that process and try to do some evaluation. And when you get through that process, it's pretty cool that there's these old papers. I've got a screenshot of volume 1, issue 1 of Earthquake Spectra. You can, in just a few minutes, you can go find any paper that's ever been published at that journal or many others. So it's cool that it's archived. The process of getting through that review means that there's a little extra credibility to your work. It doesn't guarantee that everything published is correct or couldn't be improved further, but it's some measure of credibility. And I think importantly, that process should improve your work. Right. So I think almost every time I've sent in one of my own papers for review, certainly every time I've gotten feedback that's not 100% positive, some suggestions for improvements or some criticisms, and responding to that improves my work. So the final paper that's published is better than the first one that I sent in for review. And so when the system's working well, hopefully you can feel like it doesn't mean the process is easy, but hopefully it results in a better product in the end for you and something you can be even more proud of. Some quick notes on kind of what's going on. So if you've got a paper and you're ready to submit it, you go to some journal's website, then you upload your files and upload a bunch of information, and then you kind of hear silence for a while. And so what's typically going on is that your paper's gotten uploaded into the system. There'll be some administrative checks and things first, and then the paper will go to an editor, and that's the role that I play kind of every day these days. I was working on some papers this morning. The editor is going to look at that paper and try to do some quick initial assessment. Sometimes things might stop there if there's a problem with the paper. The paper might just go back to the author with some sort of negative decision. Oftentimes it'll go to an associate editor, and that's somebody who's got a little more specialty in the area of the paper. And that associate editor will do, again, an initial review of the paper and send it off to those peers, right? So they're going to try to find some peers who have expertise in the topic of your paper. Those reviewers will read the paper, provide reviews back to an associate editor. Now kind of going up the right-hand side. The associate editor will try to synthesize all of those reviews. They don't always agree with each other. And the associate editor will try to make a recommendation back to the editor to say, look, I got reviews from these experts. Some of them, were quite positive, but we do see these problems that should be addressed, or some sort of adjustment that needs to be made, and tells that to the editor. The editor will make the final decision about what to do, which frequently is a request to revise the paper. So when all that process, you go kind of all the way down and all the way back up, and the next time you'll hear from the journal, you'll get a decision letter. And so it might look something like this. Some key things is in the first couple sentences, it'll say something about what the decision is. Almost never is the decision that the paper is just accepted. I think it's maybe happened like once in my 100 papers or something like that, and I don't think it was necessarily better than getting some productive feedback. You might get some sort of mention about some edits that are required, and there may be some language about how substantial those edits are. Is it kind of some minor things or something more major, or maybe a decision that the paper was rejected. But regardless of that decision, hopefully there will be some comments at the bottom that'll explain the context for why that decision was made, and also, in this case where there's some edits required, a list of comments that you as an author will have to respond to. So I think let's talk a little bit about kind of rejections or the kind of really negative feedback. And so again, I've got hundreds of times kind of watching this through, and there are some categories of things that happen. So I think the biggest thing that we're always looking for is what's the contribution to knowledge, right? So it could be that the authors really did a lot of work, right? They ran some very extensive set of testing. They have lots of data. They've discussed it all. But what's really the question from the journal's perspective is like, what was learned, or what would be new for the readers? And ultimately, right, we're trying to serve the readers of the journal to say, what would they benefit from if they read this paper? And so sometimes we'll see papers that's just lots and lots of writing about things that were done, but no claim of like what was learned. And so I'm listing this to kind of talk to you about what you might think about with your own papers. I think really being very clear for yourself about what is the contribution you're trying to make and stating that contribution clearly. So sometimes also there is a contribution to knowledge in the paper, but it's hard for the reviewers to identify what that contribution is. And so the more clearly that's stated, and then the more clearly the paper supports, why that contribution has been made, the better. Another thing that happens pretty often is kind of inconsistent match between the topic of the paper and the journal. So again, I work mostly for Earthquake Spectra these days, which is really focused on kind of earthquake risk analysis, kind of engineering, science, social science. Sometimes we'll get a paper on like a mechanics of a nuclear power plant or something like that. And it's like, it might be good, but like it's not really something that we focus on. And that's both not good for our readership if it's a paper that's kind of out of what they're looking for from the journal. And it's not really good for the authors if they aren't getting their paper in front of the readers that are potentially going to benefit from study of that topic. So here, you can watch that one by looking. Every journal, I think, has an aims and scope section where they talk about the topics that they're focused on. And so when you're kind of picking your journal to submit to, kind of looking for those aims and scope that align with the area you're making your contribution to, I think that's important. Third one, kind of maybe related to the top bullet is there something new here in the paper, right? Again, and that's different from was the work hard to perform, but is there some sort of new insight that's been produced? Sometimes it's a little bit hard to discern this, and this is where we need the peers to kind of weigh in and say, is there something new that's really enough so that the readers would be interested by it? Fourth one is kind of organization communication. If we get a paper and it's really hard to like follow through the paper, like what is the ideas being communicated. Sometimes if the quality of figures or the quality of grammatical correctness is so hard that it's hard to get the ideas out of it, we will sometimes reject for those reasons. This is it's not that we expect every paper to be written as if it was like a best-selling novelist or something like that. Some level of kind of grammatical problems or imperfect communication is certainly fine, and most journals have international audiences with many people writing in a second language, and that's totally understandable. But if it gets to the level where it's hard to understand the ideas, then we start to get concerned again about meeting the goals of the journal. And then the last situation is that sometimes we will get a paper in, we will get reviews, and people will say, oh, there's something interesting here, but these comments really need to be addressed to improve the paper. If the authors return back to us and basically resubmit the same paper and just argue with all of those points, we'll sometimes look at that and say, okay, well, if that's where you want to stop and draw the line, we don't think it's progressed enough that we're happy to publish it. It also is a good way to annoy the reviewers that volunteered their time to kind of review the paper. If they feel like they're just being argued with, they'll sometimes say, either this is not worth my time to keep working with them on getting it publishable, or maybe it's a symptom that the scholarship is not quite as sound as we had hoped for. So if it's really a non-responsive case, it's not too frequently that happens, but sometimes we'll just say, look, we're not going to converge to a place where we're going to be happy to publish this. So, keeping those things in mind, it can help sometimes to avoid getting stuck in those paths. Okay, so review comments. Let's say you submitted your paper, you got some review comments back. The journal said, we're interested, but you have to deal with this. So I think, and I saw some pre-panel questions that are along these lines. I remember very clearly still back in early 2000s when this happened to me. I worked for months and months and months on this paper. Several times I thought it was ready to go, and my advisor said, no more work, keep polishing it up. Okay, this thing's got to be perfect now, right? I spent some more time on this document than like anything I'd ever worked on. And it comes back with like 4 pages of stuff that I've got to fix. And it can be pretty devastating and like emotional to get that. So I get that, and I work with lots of graduate students who have that feeling too. And they come into my office after getting their comments back. I'm like, oh, it's looking pretty good. Like, what are you talking about? There's 30 things that they were complaining about. So here, the thing to realize is just that like that's universal. Like there's no reviewer and no journal that gets a paper in and says, oh, good enough, let's just go with that. Like they always are going to find something to work on, right? And so even the most amazing, brilliant, award-winning paper, somebody's going to find something to suggest. And as hard as it is to hear people say, your paper is less than perfect, just keep that perspective that hopefully going through this process is going to improve your work further, right? Everybody who's giving you all these comments is volunteering their time. I know the tone can kind of vary. Sometimes people can be a little bit, meaner with their comments, but I think for the most part, people are trying to help you improve your work, right? And so take that context. So what I do usually when I get my comments back, or what I tell my students is read all those comments once and then just put them away for a day. It's too emotional to kind of start wandering into all those and like thinking about, but they don't understand. I had this great, idea and they just aren't getting it. Just put it down for a day and kind of let the emotional side of it like dissipate for a little bit. And usually when you go back a day later, realizing that there's going to be some comments there, it doesn't feel quite as discouraging the second time you read it. And then just comb through all those comments. And I usually do kind of a first read, just thinking about, whether I fully agree or not. If I make some adjustments, could I improve the paper further? And usually I feel like, okay, I can improve the paper a little bit to address some of these things. And then think about, is the response kind of an easy thing or a hard thing, right? So sometimes people say, well, I didn't understand what you did here. And I'm like, oh, I just need one more sentence to like explain that a little bit more clearly. Or sometimes people say, that was the wrong analysis. You need to do a full other set of analyses to justify this claim you're making. And I'm like, okay, that's like a week of work actually to go do this and kind of sort out, is it a big change or is it just like a couple small words? And once you kind of go through all the comments and have like a general plan, I suggest kind of go over that list with your co-authors and just say like, here's my general plan of what I want to do. And are there some like big decisions here about, are we going to do a lot of work on a couple of these, or are we going to try to explain why we don't think more work is needed? Once you've got a general plan through all that, then you can go back and start making some changes. And so you can adjust the paper, document what you adjusted. And then when you're responding to those comments, I think be as specific as you can about what you did. So telling the reviewers, we changed the paper to fix this. That doesn't really, the reviewers got to do a lot of work to decide if you did or not. But if you can say, on line 397, we added the following sentence, and they can read that sentence and see that clarifies what their question was, that's great. And then I suggest, being polite to as much as you can. Again, realizing you're in kind of a dance with these reviewers about an ultimate decision, and being, disagreeable doesn't really help your process. but also realizing that, again, the reviewers are volunteering their time. And I think when I sit down and try to work hard on giving reviews to somebody and I see back this response that's kind of dismissive, I'm like, well, I'm not going to spend more time on this. This is like, I got, more productive things I can do with my time. So, just be civil. You don't have to, agree with the reviewer on everything, but try to be civil in your tone as you're talking through what your ideas were on your paper. Can I go backwards? Okay, so just a couple other general thoughts then. So as you're kind of heading into this process, I think a big thing you can do is just be really upfront identifying what your contribution is. So that goes back to that rejection, bullet point 1 on the rejection. If you really hone in on like what you think you're contributing with your work, you can focus on that when you're writing and really orient your paper towards that contribution. You can make it clear in your writing, and then for the reviewers, it should be clear for them as well. I think that really kind of gives you a North Star to like head towards, or some sort of finish line to head towards that can kind of orient your work. State that contribution kind of over and over again. Ultimately, that's you're setting the measuring stick that you're going to get measured against. And so if you say, my contribution is the following, and then you provide a bunch of evidence towards that, that's really what we're looking for on the review side of things. Really, get as many people to review your work before you submit it as possible. So the review process shouldn't start with the journal. Hopefully you have an advisor that's working with you on that, but hand the work to other, fellow graduate students or things like that. Having some specialists look at it can be good because they can analyze and make detailed comments on your methods and things. But having some people that are a little more removed from your work is great too, because not every reader is going to be kind of perfectly specialized in your topic. And if somebody who's a little bit removed, maybe somebody up the hall at your university, if they can kind of understand what your intentions are and they can understand your process, that's great. Or if they can't, maybe they can tell you where they got lost, and that can help you clarify things. And then the last one here is just volunteer to review papers. I mentioned in my profile kind of when I started reviewing papers, but it's really a lot through my own work reviewing other people's papers. It's made me a much stronger writer, I think, because I can see where I struggle with other people's writing. And it's easy to kind of convince yourself that your own work is crystal clear because you understand what your work is and you did all the writing. But if you take the reviewer's perspective and look at somebody else's work, you can realize, it's really hard when people just put like 15 equations in a row and they don't stop and kind of talk through what's going on. Maybe in my own writing, I need to be careful about the same thing, right? And so you can really pick up a lot of strategies, and ideally you'll see some really good papers and you can kind of think about why they were so good and try to borrow some of their strategies as well. Okay, so to wrap it up and shift towards some discussion, I think if I was to leave you with some big picture questions, it's really normal that this process feels hard and feels mysterious, right? It's a much harder process than writing a paper for a class. Your paper is going to exist for decades into the future, and it's going to go through really careful scrutiny. So it's natural that there's going to be a lot more work involved in getting to the finish line there. It's also normal that this process feels a little bit mysterious, and you've got these anonymous reviews coming back and things like that. So it doesn't mean it's impossible to navigate, but don't be hard on yourself if it feels difficult or you're not sure exactly what to be doing at different stages. And then I think also so the second point here is when you get all these reviews back or you're waiting months for reviews, it can be you can either be frustrated and say this is too slow, this is too hard, like I'm getting all this criticism, I don't like this. Or you can say, look, it's a lengthy process, but at the end of it, I'm going to have a better product because of it, right? And in the end, it's not really a choice in this world whether to participate in this process or not. It's kind of the game, and it's got good and bad things about it. But if you can think about the good outcomes that are coming out of this process, that can sometimes be motivating to keep at it. And then the final one here is that don't set yourself to the point where you need to be writing perfect papers today or next week. You want to be kind of getting better over time, right? Especially in graduate school, the goal is to train in these processes. It's not to be, ready on day one to be doing this. And if you were already ready to do this, then you don't have to what's the point of going to school and learning these things? So really take a growth mindset and say, can you get better each time? Can you pick on, some aspect of this publication process that you can work on with this paper? Maybe the next paper you work on something different, and over time it'll accumulate. And that's really why I talked to you a little bit about my journey at the beginning. is that, I wasn't a perfect writer early on. I'm still not a perfect writer, but I'm trying to get better. I'm trying to like pick on, different things that I can continue growing at. And I think as long as you're growing, then, that's the goal, right? Just like scientific knowledge, right? We don't know everything today, but we're trying to, with each paper, add a little bit more knowledge and move in a positive direction. Okay, final thing is that, so Jasmine mentioned at the beginning, I'm kind of interested in this general topic. So I've been doing a lot of writing over the last few years, and I've got a website. So the URL is there, and then this QR code will take you to that website. And then here I've just got a list of some of the different articles I've written. A bunch of them hit on topics we're going to discuss here in the next few minutes. So if you want more detail about, how to organize your paper or how to respond to reviews or things like that, you might find some interesting reading there. So I'd be very pleased if anybody found any of this helpful. Maybe I'll leave the QR, or here's what I'll do. I'll chat that URL into the Zoom meeting, so you can click off to that if you want to bookmark it. And with that, I'm done with my formal comments and look forward to having a little bit of conversation with everybody.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Baker, for the presentation on basically all parts of the academic publishing process, which does make a good segue into the panel session that we will have next. Let's figure out how to share the screen. Oh, yeah. So next we'll be moving into our Q&A panel session, where we will have NHERI GSC graduate student members who are also joining Dr. Baker on the panel. They have extensive experience with academic publishing and will be serving on the panel to provide a graduate student perspective. And so our first graduate student panelist is Natalie Coleman. Natalie is a PhD student in the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department at Texas A&M University and a graduate research assistant at urbanresilience.ai. Her research examines the disparities and risk inequalities associated with disruption in infrastructure services during the disaster impact. Natalie uses data science, machine learning, and disaster research to understand how communities recover after natural hazards such as Hurricane Harvey, Winter Storm Uri, and Hurricane Ida. She currently has 11 accepted journal articles in Sustainable Cities and Society, the International Journal of Disaster Risk Reduction, and scientific reports. For her research, she has been awarded the NSF Graduate Research Fellowship, the Aviles Johnson Fellowship, and the PEO Scholar Award. Our next NHERI GSC graduate student panelist is Amar Hamad Issa Abukhalaf. Amar is a PhD candidate and research assistant at the Florida Institute for Built Environment Resilience and a member of the Disasters, Trust, and Social Change Research Lab. He researches risk management and safety design with a focus on natural hazards, built environment, crisis management, and emergency planning. Amar is also a civil engineer and a structural designer by practice and has a master's in executive management from Ashland University in Ohio. In addition, Amar is a University of Florida registered hurricane expert and a University of Florida Outstanding Merit Award receiver for 2021. He has authored 22 peer-reviewed published papers in top journals in related fields, including the International Journal of Disaster Risk Reduction, Disaster Prevention and Management, and Natural Hazards. And with that, we will move into our panel session. And so for this, I'll ask again if anyone has questions during the panel session, feel free to raise your hand and we can call on you as the questions proceed. You can also put your questions in the chat and we can get to them that way. Otherwise, we also have a lot of questions that were submitted to us from the membership and from students on many different parts of the academic publishing process. So we can certainly get started with those questions. And as I ask them, there's no particular order for which panelists to answer first or anything. So just feel free to jump in as you have an answer for it. And so this first question, I'll try to move them through kind of the process of academic publishing as we receive them. And so this first one is, how can a researcher find or identify a novel research idea that has good potential to be published?
Okay, I think I can go first. You will have to do a lot of literature review. You will have to read. You have to know what is out there. there's no way that you can avoid reading and just going through the papers over and over. And when we say like you have to do like an extensive literature review, I mean, that could take actually a few months for you to know what's out there and what's not. But besides that, to be honest, I don't really have any other advice. You will have to do the work. So
yeah, I agree with Amar that you have to do a literature review. I think it's important to know what's out there. If you're trying to see big level ideas, I think also trying to see what NSF and national academies are focusing on and seeing what sort of themes are published in their reports. Make sure it's something that still interests you. Don't go to a different project just because you think it might be publishable. But I think it's good to look at those organizations and even certain social media or news articles or Twitter, those informal ways of seeing where the research conversation is going.
Yeah, those are great ideas. I don't have much to add. A couple other things you can think about as you're kind of doing that literature review and looking at those things is, to me, it's always nice if you can kind of point to somebody's specific problem, and if you could even like name that person, that's always nice. Like or name that organization. You hear how this city is, wishing that they had something available that they don't. And then if you can identify that there's something available to you, whether it's just your hard work or some new technology or some new data that might let you get over some sort of hurdle that kept other people from solving that problem in the past. Those are always kind of nice signs that you're on a good track. So I'll just add those things.
Great, thank you so much. So if we don't have questions from the audience, we'll move to our next one, which is, when should you start writing the manuscript for a research study or topic that you are beginning?
Okay, I think I'll go first. Still on that one. So any study that you do, most of the time you need like an ethical approval the approval from the ethical board, a research proposal, and those usually is where you actually start writing your paper. You need to have some kind of literature review that's being done to be submitted to the review board, and you will have to have the methodology written there. You don't still have any analysis, but at least for like an introduction, literature review, and a methodology, that kind of part needs to be covered in the very early phase of your project so that you can get even an approval to initiate the study. So I think this is, from my own experience, I always write those in a way that I can go back and actually integrate it in my final product, my final paper. So don't really do like an easy job when it comes to your proposals. Take it seriously and consider it to be part actually of the work that you need to be doing later. So it saves you a lot of time.
Yeah, just focusing on the methodology, I think as you are analyzing your results and you want to be able to write down at least the main ideas that you're starting to notice. Because then if you do all of your analysis and then you go back and start writing on a blank page, you're not going to be able to really capture what you were doing in the moment, what were your limitations, what your scope was. So I think kind of echoing what was being said, just sort of it's a reiterative process where you have the general outline and the main ideas that you have, but then going back to kind of make sure that everything's cohesive and there's a narrative to it. But I would start writing as soon as you can.
Once again, those are awesome responses. It's easy to go third with this panel. One extra thought there is just that I think you can also view that writing is not just something that you like have to do at the end of the cool research. Like writing is part of the thought process, and I like to say like writing is thinking, and that sometimes you can convince yourself you've got the story all figured out in your head. You go do all your work and then you go write it down and you're like, oh shoot, like actually there's like I don't have like a full chain of reasoning here of like what I did, or my results don't exactly support what I was intending to conclude. And so if you do that early writing, like the others are saying, sometimes it helps you kind of formalize your thinking, right? And you realize, oh, I actually can't quite make the argument that I'm wanting to make. And if you do that early, it may be easy to adjust your research to like actually collect the information you need or maybe you adjust your interpretation a little bit. And so I think it can really clarify your thinking to do that early, and realize like the goal is not to be writing like, again, perfect, beautiful sentences. The goal is to be like really just like documenting your chain of thought and like and what your results are and how you're interpreting them. But that can be really helpful to do early.
Great. I actually really love this question because I need to do that. And I'm starting to do that for future projects I've started, but it has definitely helped a lot to start writing once you just start the project, really. And so our next question, some professors have templates for their PhD students to help them in the process of writing papers. Is it useful to have a template for writing papers? And if so, do you have any recommendations?
Okay, so yes, they do. Most of the time people have, which is the main template, which is start with an introduction, you go with the literature review, methodology, results, and discussion, then you have your conclusion. And if you don't really have any experience in writing papers, I would recommend you follow that, at least so that you get a sense of what's happening. Another thing that you can actually be doing is looking at well-cited papers and well-known papers, and you just see how things were done in that, and you try to mimic what at least the style of the writing or the organization of the paper. But what I noticed is also being a reviewer for other journals, that can be sometimes a limitation for you on the long run. So if you don't have an experience, start with that. But you should also know that this is not the only way of doing it. People have different writing styles, and sometimes that kind of a structure of the paper can be limiting actually your study. So if you need to be creative in some areas, I mean, that is always encouraged. But at the beginning, if you don't really have any experience in writing, I would recommend also like sticking to like a template, or you have something that you can refer to.
Yeah, I will also say that if you have an idea of what journals you want to submit to, it's probably good to see what sort of format they follow. So some of the journals that I've submitted to, they don't mind if the literature review is part of the introduction, but others are very explicit. And I got a paper returned where they were confused that I didn't have a literature review as a separate section. And so those are common mistakes that you want to avoid. So if you know where you want to send your paper, just make sure that you know what the journal requirements are, what they consider to be the word limit, if they consider figures to be part of that word limit, if they have restrictions on the supplemental information. But I definitely agree that that is technically the sample paper template of like intro, review, methods. But just make sure that the journal that you want to send your paper to doesn't have any other specifications that might lead to like an early rejection.
Yeah, that's great. I totally agree with all that. See if I can add anything else. So even, so I think and the conceptual outline and template is really the key thing, which I think you've been hearing about. Sometimes there's some formatting things of like numbered sections and not, and a lot of times journals will even have like a document template that kind of formats things appropriately. That can be useful to grab early as well. The other thing I'd say, I really like the strategy of like grabbing some papers and kind of copying the style, both in terms of the outline, but you can also see things. I know there were some questions about like how much detail should I provide on like background methods and things. And if you're looking at other papers, you can get a sense from that type of thing as well. Of like, are other people writing on my topic and writing in my journal, like how much are they getting into detail on prior knowledge, or how do they format figures and how much detail do they put in figure captions? A lot of that you can try to figure it out by just looking at how other people have done it, particularly papers that you found really clear or compelling. If you can kind of borrow from their choices, that's a good starting point.
Yeah, I just did also to add one thing. It's also like if you're going through the requirements of the journal and you feel like some points are not really clear to you, one thing that you can do is that go to the recently published articles in that journal and just take a look at it and see things will start making more sense about these comments, because sometimes like it's too rigid and you don't really know what that actually means. It feels too broad. But once you see like one paper, 2, 3 from the recently published one at that particular journal, you start making sense of what's happening.
Okay, I see Raimi, you have a question in the chat, and then I see some hands raised. So Raimi, since you asked first, you can go ahead and ask your question, and then we'll get to the hands.
Yes, thank you so much for the opportunity. And I must say, the presentation was fantastic and an eye-opener. But my concern is for a PhD candidate who has published some of his work in high-impact journals, in Scopus Index and some other high-impact journals. But during the period of defense, the external supervisor came and rubbished the entire work. I want to know, is that appropriate in the first instance? And I also noticed that it's like there is a bias which actually affects the PhD student in question. In this regard, what best approach do you think such students can actually make use of? Thank you, and over.
Great. Thanks for the question and the comments. Maybe I'll take a first stab. So I think, maybe somewhat implicit in the slides I had, in this world, like there's always going to be this mix of some successes and some criticisms of your work, and kind of navigating through all of that can be complicated and difficult at times, but it's kind of inherent. On my website, one of the things I've got posted up there towards the bottom is like 10 pages of negative review comments that I've gotten from proposals I've written. I've gotten like dozens of proposals rejected. I don't know how many papers rejected. Like, I get negative feedback frequently as well, despite being kind of more experienced along my professional trajectory. And so I think to recognize that negative feedback or sometimes constructive criticism, sometimes unconstructive criticism is going to kind of come your way, and not let that kind of one person's opinion doesn't mean that you have no contributions or no good ideas. It's an opinion that to be navigated, and if there's something useful to take out of that feedback and do even better, great. If there's not something useful out of it, that sometimes happens as well. Sometimes intertwined with that is your milestones of publishing a paper or getting your thesis accepted, and sometimes you have to kind of diplomatically navigate those processes to say, what is the response that's needed here to get to the outcome I need. That's that's something to keep in mind, but I think don't take any of that negative feedback as like, oh, definitively everything's going wrong and I'm not going to get to my goals or nobody's going to care about my work. That's not what that information means necessarily. I hope that's useful.
Thank you so much for the insightful comment. I think the suggestion you gave is highly useful.
Excellent. Good luck moving forward.
All right, with that, we'll move on to our next question. I see Grace has a hand raised. You can ask your question, and then after her, Yang, you can.
We don't hear anything, Grace.
Oh, I don't think we can hear you. Okay, we can do that. Okay, Yang, you can ask your question.
That's a good presentation, Dr. Baker. This is Yang from University of Washington. So recently I have a kind of question, kind of concerning for me a little bit. So now I have a kind of part of work from my PhD dissertation, but it's kind of really lengthy. It has lots of materials, but I always think that the structure of that work cannot be separated. I try to, because it includes like data collection through simulation, and also the next part about the data analysis part. So I want to, I mean, first things that I try to separate them into two parts. But some points, they are just entangled together. It's really hard to disseminate it. Do you think is that possible that I can just send the email to the journal I want to submit and say, hey, this is my work, but it's kind of the work is kind of long. Do you think it's possible that they can also be published as the part 1, part 2 series the paper? Do you think so? I mean, from my point, I try to separate them, but I don't think it's necessary to do that, because if you separate it, all the structure of the work can be broken. Yeah, so this is a kind of question, reason it concerns me a lot.
Yeah, so that's a common. So I would say maybe half of the papers that come into Earthquake Spectra, when I get them, the authors are saying, I know this paper is over the length limit, but I have so much work that I just have to include it all in here. So I definitely get the instinct that I did all this work, it's all part of this, and I need to communicate it all. Just to give you a counterpoint, you're asking a lot of a reader when you're asking them to read a very long, complicated document, and the reader is not obligated to read this. Oftentimes, the decision is like, move on, I'm going to read something else. If it's really pages and pages, and they're not kind of seeing where the point is getting to. I'll also note that the really high impact journals, Science and places like that, they'll give you 6 pages or something to write your work up, and Nobel Prize winning work has been written up in 6 pages. So a couple of things you might think about just to try to see if there's a way to get shorter here is one, most journals now will let you use electronic supplements and supplemental materials and things like that. So you can oftentimes go to a shorter document and reference off to some appendices for some background if there's some detail. And it's not necessary for the reader to see that before they can follow your train of thought, but maybe an interested reader might want to access that information and it's still available to them. You mentioned your thesis. You might also be able to reference your thesis for some supporting information and just really put kind of the key pieces in the paper. And one final thing is, this is a little bit different train of thought, is that I would really think hard about your contribution and what is the message you want to come out of that paper. And it may be that there are really interesting parts of the paper that are not directly supporting that contribution, or maybe you can narrow what the contribution is such that some parts become not necessary. And a phrase I like here is interesting but irrelevant. There's a big sense that I worked really hard, I got this interesting thing, but if I step back, it's not actually supporting the conclusions I'm drawing, or it's not actually supporting my contribution, or it's a different contribution. Those things can be stripped off, and the reader can still follow your train of thought and follow your contribution. It doesn't mean that the part that got stripped off is bad. It just means that it's not relevant for this particular document. So I think if you can have a really laser focus on that contribution, that might help you see, actually, I could skip this one digression or this underlying data acquisition part. That can be supplemental. It's okay if the reader doesn't see that before they see kind of my analysis. So those might be some strategies to help you navigate that. I know it's hard, and it can be painful. One other final thought is I don't delete text in those cases. I just copy and paste it to a separate document. Right? It's really hard to throw away stuff you worked so hard on. But if you can just move it to the side, oftentimes you can see that actually a much simpler, shorter document can still make the point regarding your contribution. And the other parts can be either supplemental or a separate document or something like that.
Yeah. Honestly, I think this is a really good advice. And also, being an editor, I would say even if you send me a paper and I have a word limit of 10,000, for example, and you explain that you need more, you'll have also to be reasonable in your request. I can maybe give you 14,000, but I cannot really double it at one point. However, think of it as how you summarized your entire paper in an abstract. Because when you're forced to really summarize it and talk about it briefly in 250 words, it is kind of the same perspective. There's a lot making, it's part of the communication, and it becomes better with the practice. You need to know what is relevant, what is not, how much to go in depth, and how much. I know, like, when it comes, especially when you're working in your dissertation and you're trying to convert it like in a shorter version of a paper, it feels like you're letting go of a lot of things that you worked on. But it doesn't really have to be this way. I just think about it, it's like it's kind of an abstract of your dissertation, this one paper. Also, if you want to make it as a series and publish it as a paper 1 and paper 2, each paper has to stand alone, to be a separate paper, and it stands alone by itself. I did it before, but most of the papers that I published, they stand alone by itself. So you cannot really do one part and kind of leave it as to be continued on the second paper. Usually it doesn't really work like that. So I'm not really sure if Natalie has also something to add.
Yeah, I think a lot of the points have already been made. I guess I'll just add that I understand the concern of you've been working on this for so long. So in your mind, it seems like these two ideas are very interconnected. So it might be beneficial to talk to an advisor or a colleague, or even somebody who is more, I know at my university, we have university writing centers who has no idea about your previous work and might be able to help you piece out what is actually important to a reader. And so that might be being able to split up your dissertation into 2 parts, or it might just be one stronger paper that references your thesis if the reader wants to know more information. A tip that I usually do is, if you're going to summarize your paper into maybe 6 figures, what would those figures be? And what would the main contribution be? And that might help you if, are these figures necessary? Or is this just information that could be in an appendix if the reader wants to know more about that data simulation? Or is the data simulation part of a new contribution that I want to make into a separate paper? So just taking the time to invest into that and reflect on what's important would really help. But congratulations on your thesis, and good luck as you're trying to format it and publish it.
Thank you all the guys' advice. It really helped.
So, question in the chat from Grace. Well, I guess the second part of that question: how can you navigate some journal requirements that content that has not been published before can be submitted?
Maybe I'll take first stab because I deal with this one a lot in my editor job. And so a lot of times we will get papers that will come in and it'll be some development from prior work. So a common situation is, PhD thesis on the topic, and somebody's extracting some of those results and writing them up as a journal paper. Sometimes it's a peer report, Grace, as you know, and some part of that report is getting published. Or the other one is a conference paper. So somebody's written a part of their work in a conference paper and they're expanding it out into a journal paper now. So 2 things to know is that most journals have, I think these days, have a plagiarism checker that'll go scrape the internet and see if there's any related work. So usually if there's text coming out of that, out of your document that's somewhere else in the world, it'll be found. So assume it'll get noticed if that's the situation. So on rare occasions, fortunately, it's somebody else's paper, or it's a repeat of a published paper, and that's really not tolerated. It's a very easy decision what to do in those cases. But sometimes we'll find a conference paper that's got 20% of the paper is the same as this conference paper. So first, the things I would do to navigate that is check there's author guidelines. Every journal's got some guidelines where they talk about what's required, and some of them will talk about this issue specifically. For earthquake spectra, we say, we'll consider those situations, but we want, perhaps for a PhD thesis, we're happy to republish because we're going through the peer review process and it's archival, whereas the thesis may not be archived as well. For a conference paper, we'll consider it, but we want a significant new scope. We don't want just a repeat of the conference paper. And then when you're so kind of sort out what the journal expects, and then when you write the cover letter, you put a little letter at the front of your paper when you submit. Just make a note in there to say, this paper is an expansion of a conference paper. We used similar methods, but the conference paper was only like a quick trial case study. Here we've done a more more comprehensive study, and we've synthesized new results. So here's the extra contribution. If you can kind of explain what's been added, that's great. Or you just make a note. This is work from my PhD thesis, but I've taken out a chunk of it to be considered for publication. So just declare it, and then the journal knows that you're being upfront with what you're doing, and they'll check against their policies. But in general, we're happy to have work that's shown up in some form, as long as it hasn't shown up in like a prior journal paper or not in kind of comprehensive form in a conference. At least for my journal. Some of the other journals like Science or something can be a little more strict about that. They want to see nothing previously, but you can sort that out by looking at the author guidelines.
Yeah, I mean, also if you have a question about that in particular, or what is the percentage that is allowed to be matching with another document, and you don't really find it in the author's document guidelines, you can just reach out to the journal by an email, and usually one of the staff would like immediately reply back to you with that. So don't be afraid to just ask your questions before you submit, because it would save you a lot of time instead of going through the process and waiting for reviewers to be assigned and then get rejected and come back to you. So yeah, be in the know from the beginning. That would make things much easier for you.
Yeah, I will just add that if you are aware that a particular work you want to send to a journal and those specific author guidelines are quite strict, maybe try to see if you want to submit as a conference paper, maybe more as a presentation or poster instead, so that you can still get the feedback that you want, but might assist you as you're going over the journal publishing process. Don't let that stop you from submitting conference papers, but just think about exactly where you want this work to go and how much you want it to be in a particular area. And I think talking to your advisor as well, knowing what are the journal requirements will also help.
That's okay, Grace. We'll have one more question from Cheng Shin in the chat, and that will be our last question for the panel, but it's also a great question. How to balance the quantity and quality of a paper as a PhD student?
I think it's a very different for everyone. Every major is different. Every situation is different. For me, I come from a research of natural hazards and disaster management, so it's kind of different. Even when we say the quality of it, I'm assuming when we say the quality is what kind of journal are you kind of trying to publish in? And mine usually have less of impact factor than the others. So if you can find any journal, for example, with a 2 impact factor in social sciences or disaster studies or disaster management, that's a really good indication that this paper is good. However, in different majors, 2 is not really as good of a number. So it's different for each major. The quantity, I wouldn't really recommend that you aim too high. Even that, I was like, sometimes like on the average person, on the average PhD student, don't try to, for example, publish at the very top of the journals, and especially if it's your first. Maybe start with something more reasonable. So that's the thing that I personally did, and I think worked well for me, just building on experience, getting experience, and trying to even aim higher when it comes to the journals one by one. Well, I have more to add, but I would like also to give the other Jack and Natalie sometimes to see what they think about this.
So I don't want to sound too I guess calculating, but usually the strategy that we use is sort of like a paper pipeline, where you submit a paper, you know where you want to send it, and then you start working on one and on your manuscript for the other one, and then the analysis. That way, when you get paper back, you're working on revisions. And so, because something that I think is good to be aware of in the publishing process is that sometimes your paper will be there for 6 months, one time I had a paper that didn't come back for 2 years. And so if you aim too high and you're waiting back on that one paper, then you might not be able to showcase your ability as a publishing researcher. So I think it's good to spread out your work and know you might want to target specific journals, but also have other journals in mind. And that also kind of just shows your diversity as a researcher and where you can publish. But I think it's just a personal thing as well, but also know your paper might be stuck in the pipeline for a year or two. Maybe they weren't able to find reviewers. Maybe there's something going on at the journal. So be aware that you want to kind of diversify your profile. And as a PhD student, I think personally, there's more value into being able to publish and show that you can publish, as opposed to if you're a faculty member, then I think the prestige of the journal plays into more of a factor because you have different roles. So also keep that in mind. Hopefully that doesn't sound too calculating, but it's good to have like a plan when you go about these things.
Those are great thoughts. I'm glad to hear that my junior colleagues don't feel too much pressure that volume is the only thing, or they've resisted it, even if they're getting that message. I largely agree. I think there's at a baseline, you want to learn how to navigate this process and show that you're producing work that's publishable. But beyond some kind of baseline level, I don't think there's a lot of. Let me back up one more second. It's also it depends a lot on what your goals are. So if your goal is to just get your degree and move to an industry job, a volume of publications may not be a huge priority there, as much as some other considerations. Some other institutions, either where you're at or where you want to work at, they might put a lot of weight on kind of volume of publication, and then you might have to consider that in your strategy. So it kind of depends on where you're trying to get to. If you can kind of find people a little further on your trajectory and where you're trying to get to and see what they're doing, that could be informative. I think I agree with Amer that it kind of depends in that regard. But then, so back to volume, I really think that for the most part, people get opportunities because of the quality of the work or the impact of some narrow amount of work rather than the volume of work. Right? And so I know in my institution, Stanford, they really put a lot of premium on kind of the quality of work. And if you've only got 1 or 2 papers after several years as a faculty member, that'll raise eyebrows. But doubling your number of papers doesn't get you much more points. And usually we're either hiring or promoting. We're saying we really want her. She's doing this amazing work with wind turbines and typhoons. We don't say we really want her because of these 37 projects. And the first project is this, and the second project is this, and the third project is this. Usually it's like kind of a 1 or 2 sentence soundbite about the methods or the questions that somebody's working on, and like excellence there is more important than lots and lots of papers on related topics. And so don't put all your eggs in one basket, as Natalie said, but I wouldn't try to spread yourself super thin and be just firing off lots and lots of stuff that's of kind of more moderate or marginal quality. I don't think that's going to get you too far in most environments.
All right. With that, I guess we'll conclude today's workshop. First, just wanted to say thank you so much to our speakers, Dr. Baker, Natalie, and Amar. Thank you all for wanting to talk with us today and discuss all of this information. I personally came out with a lot of very useful advice that will certainly help me as I continue my PhD program. And if anyone here has any additional questions, you can reach out to me or reach out to the speakers and we can relay those for you. Otherwise, thank you everyone so much for attending, and yeah, have a great weekend.